This evening, Hispanic Heritage Matters in Texas proudly hosts Brandon Seale. We're continuing our matters for discussion. This evening, we're talking about the April 6, 1813 Texas Declaration of Independence, its first Declaration of Independence. Yep, 208 years ago. So, Brandon, start off with the introduction, please.
Sure. Anthony, thanks for having me. And let's see, I've got some echo here. Is everyone on mute? There you go. That sounds better. And first off, let me just say what a treat it is to be with this group. As I look through the last names on the screen, I see Corbelos and Tarins and Delgados, and really everything I'm talking about here is about your ancestors. And so it's anyway, like I said, it's a treat to give this talk today on the 208th anniversary of the signing, or at least the declaration of this instrument. And so, my background, I have degrees in philosophy, law, and business. I've worked for pretty much my entire professional career in northern Mexico and the Texas-Mexico border. It's just always fascinated me. I remember a moment about 3 or 4 years ago. I built a pipeline from Laredo down to Monterrey. And I remember a moment or a week during that construction where I found myself in the same week. I was in Lampazos de Naranjo, which is a little town in Nuevo León, Coahuila, right on the border there, which was founded around a mission that was built by Father Margil de Jesus, one of the Franciscan missionaries. And then later in the week, I was down in Monterrey at the Church of the Purísima Concepción, I think it's called, which was also a church founded by Father Margil de Jesus. And then later in the week, I was back in San Antonio, back near Mission San Jose, which is also founded. So anyway, I feel like my professional life has kind of followed the trail of some of these events that I love to study. But I also feel like, too, that history is a little bit of an unfair thing, because it's very easy to repeat a historical narrative once it takes hold. It's a lot harder to really dig in and try and put yourself in the place of the people that were living it. But once you do, it's amazing how different interpretations can come out from that. And so I've really enjoyed exploring those different interpretations, just from my perspective as a South Texan who's worked a lot of his career in northern Mexico and on the border, in which, of course, San Antonio and Texas was very much a border town and a border state for most of its history. And so I'm going to talk tonight in specific about this document, the first Texas Declaration of Independence. And I'll begin by trying to give a little kind of thumbnail sketch, like Anthony suggested here, at least to set the stage or the background for what we're doing, which is that basically on April 6th, 1813, a revolutionary junta met in San Fernando de Béjar, which we, of course, refer to just collectively as San Antonio today, and drafted Texas's first Declaration of Independence. And this junta is actually a direct result, or it's a direct consequence of Father Miguel Hidalgo's revolt in Mexico, which started famously on September 16th, 1810, with his Grito de Dolores. And a lot of people don't know this, but actually Father Miguel Hidalgo was actually trying to escape to San Antonio when he was captured, and then executed at the Acatitas de Bajan in Coahuila. But he was trying to get to San Antonio because San Antonio already had this reputation as being kind of a very fiercely independent, kind of cantankerous, individualistic frontier town. And so he thought of San Antonio as kind of a safe place to recharge and try and reinvigorate his revolt. And of course, he never made it, but the spirit of the revolt continued on. And actually, just a few days before he was captured, he commissioned a man by the name of Jose Bernardo Gutierrez de Lara, who was from actually Revilla, down in the Rio Grande, in the lower Rio Grande Valley. He commissioned him as kind of his ambassador to the United States. And Gutierrez de Lara took this commission seriously. And so he took this, he went to New Orleans first and started kind of building his network and started recruiting for this. He ends up traveling overland all the way to Washington, D.C. He meets with Secretary of State James Monroe. He meets with President James Madison. They're very sympathetic. They like the idea of a revolution against Spain, but this is also 1812. The U.S. is about to get into a war with its old imperial master at the same time, so they can't really offer much more except moral support for it. So Gutierrez de Lara comes back to the border, back to the Louisiana-Texas border, and begins recruiting. And he builds this really fascinating kind of multi-ethnic force, which is about half Tejanos and about half Anglo-Americans. And it's a strange lot. It's a strange group of people, and we don't have time to go into that. But I should also add, too, he was also very successful at recruiting Native Americans, a lot of Lipan Apaches, Tonkawas, and even Comanches at a different time. which this too, it's a testament to kind of the deep ties that these frontiersmen, these fronterizos living in Texas and the Rio Grande Valley had to the Native American communities around them too. That as much as they were shaped a lot of times by fighting those communities, they're also shaped by their kind of shared bonds with them. So starting in August of 1812, Gutierrez de Lara crosses the Sabine River into Texas. He defeats a royalist army at Nacogdoches. He then marches down, defeats a royalist army at Goliad. He then marches up to San Antonio, defeats the royalist army there, and captures the Spanish governor. He then actually executes the Spanish governor. And then they send up another Spanish royalist army from further down in Mexico to try and punish him, and he defeats that one too. And so that in April of 1813, Texas found itself in this really unique situation of being, according to one author at least, the first province in Spanish America to have rid itself entirely of any Spanish royal presence. And so this is kind of the high that they're riding in April of 1813 when they sit down to issue this document. So like I said, it's a revolutionary junta of local people. And actually, Anthony will like this. It consists of 4 Delgados and 3 Arrochas are on the first junta. San Antonio families, basically. But in addition to that, too, there's also signatories that are very close allies of Gutierrez de Lara. And actually, there's a Tarin who's one of the signatories there. I recognize that one. And anyway, some other names too. So that's a very short background for this. And basically, I kind of want to spend the rest of the time on just the text of the Declaration too, because I think it's fascinating. I think it tells us a lot about what these people were thinking and what they were influenced by and what ideas they had in mind for the future of Texas. So the opening lines of this document, they begin, Nos el pueblo de la provincia de Texas. This was written in Spanish. Nos el pueblo, but I've got the translation here going in English. So, first off, what's interesting about this is the language of these opening lines is very much inspired or influenced, at least, by the North American Constitution and the North American Declaration of Independence. We the people, those are the opening lines of the United States Constitution. And then the whole first paragraph reads very, very much like the U.S. Declaration of Independence. Especially this last line that we've kind of highlighted here. A decent respect for our own dignity and to the opinions of the world requires that we relate the causes that are about this measure. The equivalent line from the U.S. Declaration of Independence is a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. And what's so interesting about this is that the events that actually preceded the War of Mexican Independence are actually much more influenced by events going on in Spain. And over there, the equivalent document is the Constitution of Cádiz, which is a document written in 1812, which is kind of like a first Spanish act of independence or of anti-monarchism, and it very much inspires, and in some ways has been viewed as the first act of independence of the Spanish Americas. But you don't hear a lot of echoes of that document. You hear some, but you don't hear a lot of echoes of the Constitution of Cádiz in this Texas Declaration of Independence. So I think there's another document too that we can look at, which is there's a Mexican Declaration of Independence, which actually comes after this one. There's a Mexican Declaration of Independence, which also demonstrates, I think, an important difference between how these people in Texas conceived of their movement and how other folks in Mexico were thinking of it too. Because the way the words that they use, like in the Constitution of Cádiz and in the Mexican Declaration of Independence, is they declare independence in the name of Congress, or they declare independence in the name of Las Cortes, of like the parliamentary body which is assembled. So it's like that body is then declaring the independence, and then as a result, as you go on, that's where sovereignty resides in these documents, is in these parliamentary bodies. And this is very much kind of more in the French tradition, in the continental tradition, versus, the language here very much relates their version of independence to something that's more similar kind of to North American track. And again, this shouldn't be a surprise that most of these people, Tejanos, that are living in what was then the province of Texas, but also people living along the Rio Grande, in the Rio Grande Valley, in the Villas del Norte, they call them, they were much more closely connected to North America through their trade relationships with New Orleans and with other places than they were even with places in the interior of New Spain, in the interior of Mexico. And in fact, I'll get to this in a minute. It's actually a major grievance that they have against the Spanish monarchy are kind of the trade rules, the trade laws, which bound them to trade with Veracruz and with these places because it was so much more expensive. because basically the trade with Veracruz had to go through basically licensed intermediaries, and every step along the way the price went up. There's a point in Texas where, you know, products like cotton and cloth and tobacco and coffee, they cost 4 to 8 times as much in San Antonio as they cost back in Veracruz, and even more than what they cost in New Orleans. So you already have these kind of deep commercial ties, and this explains too why Gutierrez de Lara is able to raise this kind of multi-ethnic army of Tejanos and Anglo-Americans. They've already started establishing some really interesting ties. There's another example of this too, in this phrase, natural law. And by the way, too, a lengthy series of occurrences. This also kind of echoes the United States Declaration of Independence, where they start cataloging kind of the grievances. But there's this phrase here at the end: since the moment of our abandonment, the natural law of self-preservation, that most sacred privilege of human creation, has made necessary the measures we now take. So again, this places this document decidedly in the natural law tradition, which truthfully is not a continental tradition. It's not something that you see, for example, in the French Declaration of the Rights of Man, or in the Constitution of Cadiz. I mean, actually, in the Constitution of Cadiz, there's conditions you have to satisfy as a citizen to be able to have rights. In theory, it didn't always work this way in practice, of course, in these other jurisdictions. But in theory, the theory of natural law is that every human being is born inherently kind of with these rights, and that they're enforceable against other people and other government entities. And so here's kind of some of the language of this. Let's see. El derecho natural de la conservación propia, a quien solamente pertenece este derecho al pueblo, is what it talks about here too. There's also actually in another document, Gutierrez de Lara, talks about how he's inspired by todo derecho natural. So like, here's kind of a quote from another part of the document that I don't think I have on the screen here, but quote, governments are instituted for the well-being and happiness of the communities they govern, and not for the enrichment of a few individuals. When this end is perverted and the government becomes a tool of oppression, the people have the right to change it to one better adapted to their needs. Men are born free and begin their lives from the same point. They are formed in the image of their creator, to whom alone they must humble themselves. Who will say that we have not rightly arrived at the end of our patience? That we are more than justified in choosing now a new form of government and casting off the rulers under whom we have not we have not enjoyed the full exercise of our liberties. Well, as much as I've highlighted, initially at least, some of kind of the North American influences on the document, I now want to take it down to the local level, because the grievances that they actually go through are decidedly Texan and decidedly local. The first one I've already alluded to, this concept of free trade. This is a major grievance that you will see in 1813. You'll see it in 1832 with the Bear Remonstrance. You'll see it in 1835, 36. You'll see it in the Federalist Wars in 1838 and 40, when Nuevo León, Coahuila, Tamaulipas try and kind of start their own separatist movement in the Republic of the Rio Grande, which actually is what my next season of the podcast is going to be about. But it's a consistent theme that I think it's a legacy of kind of the Spanish royal mercantilist system, which very much tries to extract a lot of value back to the center. It tries to extract a lot of value back to the crown, and then in later years, kind of back to the center, back in Mexico City. But it makes it very costly for people living on the border, people living on the fringes, because those are the people that see that tax, that see those tariffs, and they're enormous tariffs. The tariffs are anywhere from 25 to 50% to 80%, depending on the good. And so this is a consistent grievance from people living in Texas and along the Rio Grande Valley, because it artificially inflates the price of things, because they see how much things cost right next door in New Orleans, but they're having to pay kind of these artificial prices, and then, by those means, artificially inflating the profits of the second one here, kind of these monopolies, these crown-appointed monopolies. And, it's annoying that they have to buy their tobacco from the official tobacconist, and that they have to use the stamped paper, the timbre, the stamped paper requirements, which, by the way, too, this is something that American colonists, will complain about in 1776 too, and the famous Stamp Act and stuff like that. The third one they talk about is the uneven, corrupt, and slow application of the laws. The problem too of a lot of these communities living in San Antonio, living in the Rio Grande Valley, is they're so far removed from the centers of decision making that they basically can't count on government action to give them redress for wrongs. That there's essentially no redress for even just little petty crimes. And so actually they do set up these little kind of small courts, and they actually kind of develop the first jury systems, kind of makeshift jury systems in the Hispanic tradition all here on the Texas frontier. But that's a little bit later, actually. And the fourth one is that it's a consistent complaint that they can't get lands patented to them, that there's all this land all around them in Texas and South Texas and all around them, but that the Crown is very, very reluctant to release those lands for their private development. And the ones that I put in bold here, the free trade, monopolies, and the challenge to get lands patented out to private individuals, these are three things that you're going to see the new Republic of Texas in 1836 address almost immediately. With respect to the lands patented, they're going to go on a frenzy of patenting lands in the first 3 years of the Republic of Texas. Not always evenly, not always equitably, but they're addressing this very, very long held complaint. Obviously, the concept of the monopolies and the stamped paper requirements are also going to disappear under the new republic. And the free trade piece, the Republic of Texas wouldn't be entirely without tariffs, but they would be significantly reduced. So, as we get kind of we're starting to get now toward the end of the document. I've skipped around obviously, but we're working now toward the end of the document, and there's a change in tone. There's a change in tone that happens here that I think is really interesting, because suddenly they start talking about this. Look toward the bottom where I've got this highlighted, that that they're basically they're going to form a government to ensure domestic tranquility, to effect our independence, to establish a government for that nation, to treat with foreign nations, to maintain harmonious relationships with neighboring states and those in the interior of the Republic of Mexico, to provision an army, and to zealously defend our holy religion, as well as justice, reason, and the sacred rights of man. So that clause, the sacred rights of man, is a direct appeal to the continental tradition. So it's almost like they've started this document acknowledging an influence from the North American tradition, which is represented in the army too, which has won these battles, the Republican Army of the North. It consists, like I said, of Tejanos and of Anglo-Americans. But as they start from kind of this piece of North American influence, then they work through their grievances, which are decidedly local, and then it's almost like they kind of turn back to the Hispanic tradition. They turn back to the Hispanic world. And they start talking about this idea of the Republic of Mexico, which is a funny idea, because there is no Republic of Mexico at this time. And actually, this is one of the earliest mentions in Mexican history of this idea of a Republic of Mexico. So there's this other line here as the document starts to conclude. The Revolutionary Junta shall exercise in public such legal functions as necessary until such time as a General Congress of the Mexican Republic shall be formed to otherwise delegate those authorities. And so, like I said, this starts to be really, really interesting, because what we have to do is we have to square their declaration at the beginning of the document, which declares them free of any obligation to any foreign power, absueltos de deber y obligación a todo poder extranjero. Yet they're clearly almost acknowledging kind of a different. They are acknowledging a Mexican republic that they may be accountable to, and that starts to feel funny when you think about that. And this is why the heading of this slide is this the First Republic of Texas, or is this a declaration of a First Republic of Mexico? And just to kind of drive this point home, that some of the last lines of the document here is that of this declaration is actually a declaration of alignment with Mexico and an aspiration for Texas to, quote, lead a rebirth of the Mexican people, taking in our hands the reins of our government, end quote, which is a fitting horse-based metaphor for kind of horse-crazed Tejanos. This is one of the things about the Tejano culture, is that there's jokes that they won't walk anywhere. They'll only ride their horses everywhere. Indeed, 11 days later, this same junta will approve a constitution that also echoes the same idea, that this newly independent state of Texas was to be part of a, quote, Mexican republic to which it remains inviolably joined. I realize that this almost kind of undermines a little bit the point that I've made elsewhere, which is that, is this really a first declaration of independence for Texas? Because they're declaring independence, but they're also declaring their alignment, their confederation, or their federation with these other Mexican states at the same time. And I want to suggest, this is kind of an idea that I'm working through for this next series of my podcast too, that this is a really important tension that I don't think people have picked up on enough or talked about enough. But there's this story from the early days of the Alamo siege in 1836. So we're jumping ahead 23 years here. But there's this story where Juan Seguin and Jim Bowie are writing a letter. And I can't remember the context exactly, but they're writing a letter, and Seguin signs it Dios y Federación, God and Federation, which is a very common kind of salutation in the letters of Mexican Federalists at that time. And according to the anecdote, Jim Bowie scratches out Federación and writes Texas, Dios y Texas. And I feel like the way that this story is often told in typically kind of the Anglo-influenced histories is like, this is kind of this moment where they realize they're fighting for independence or something like that. But I think it may be something else if it's true. Like I said, I don't really know the sourcing of the story. Because what I think it may suggest is that Tejanos have a very different concept even of independence and of sovereignty than even the Anglos that are fighting alongside them in 1813 and then later in 1836. And I think you kind of see in the 1835-36 revolution, I think you see this kind of divergence of ideas of what sovereignty and of what independence really means. And I think you see it even here back in 1813. Because by the way, after this document is published, you start to see there's a reduction in the number of Anglo-American volunteers in the Republican Army of the North. They don't go away altogether. There's still several hundred of them that hang around, but some go away and there's different theories as to why. But it certainly seems like some of them didn't like the idea that they were fighting for the independence of a state of Texas that was going to be federated still with Mexico. They had some idea of a totally independent Texas. But you see almost the opposite of this too in 1836 with a lot of Tejanos. A famous example is Jose Maria Carvajal. Jose Maria Carvajal is one of the most radical Federalists that you're ever going to find. And he's initially one of the biggest supporters of the revolt in 1835-36. He'll lose $35,000 personally. That's a lot of money at that time, trying to smuggle in supplies from New Orleans to try and aid the initial stages of the revolt. But he eventually starts to feel kind of like it. Actually, he gets elected to the Independence Convention at Washington on the Brazos, but he doesn't go because he starts to feel like it's going a different direction. And so it's kind of a tragic prelude, I think, to what then happens in 1836 and after that, where there's just clearly there's a different idea of what it means for Texas to be independent. And it stems from the different traditions that these people are coming from. And, in the Hispanic, there's a great book about this by Timothy Anna called Forging Mexico. And he talks about this. In the Hispanic tradition, basically sovereignty always kind of resides at the municipal level, at like the level of the town, the community, that's where sovereignty always resides. And that it's meant to withstand changes in kings and succession crises and wars on other continents and stuff like that. But like the local community always persists and always retains its sovereignty, and that it can eventually kind of realign back with whoever emerges on top or back with the other entities in the same cultural tradition. But this is not the Anglo-American cultural tradition. The Anglo-American tradition of independence is different. It views independence and sovereignty as a permanent kind of cutting of cords. And I don't know, I haven't teased through all the ideas yet. I haven't quite worked it out. But it's interesting for me to think about. In closing, I think the last words of this document are quite powerful. And they're kind of a reminder of a time back when people had to mean what they said. In order to give greater weight to this declaration and inspire due confidence in our new nation, we each and all solemnly swear before the Holy Ghost, before our brothers throughout this republic, and before the universe at large, that we will defend and sustain to the very end, hasta la última extremidad, our new nation and the principles upon which it was founded, with our fortunes and with our lives. And unfortunately, for those of you who know what comes after, this is indeed what it will cost them. It'll cost them their fortunes and their lives. And anyway, I'll conclude just real quickly with a project that we're doing kind of related to this. As a lot of you know, the battlefield for the Battle of Medina, which is how this incredible drama ends, and tragically, on August 18th, 1813, just 4 months after the issuance of this Declaration of Independence. The battlefield has never been archaeologically confirmed or never been found in modern times. And so we've actively launched a project with the collaboration of a veterans group, with the Texas Historical Commission, and with the Atascosa County Historical Commission to try and find this battlefield. We've got some high probability sites that we're gonna that we're going to go out and try and use some modern archaeological techniques to survey and see if we can confirm the presence of any battle. And if you're interested in supporting, by the way, there's a little link here. We'd love it. We've had some good luck so far raising money, and we want to get some more raised so that we can really do this the right way. And so with that, I'll wrap up. If you're interested in learning more about this, like I said, I do have a podcast. You can go to my website is one way to find it, brandonseale.com. You could also go on the Rivard Report, which is now called the San Antonio Report, or you can go on iTunes or Stitcher, Spotify also, and find my podcast there. It's called A New History of Old Texas. And you can hear, if 25 minutes of me talking about this wasn't enough, you can go on there and hear me talking about this for like 20 hours. So anyway, I'm going to wrap up here and would love to take some questions if there are any. And thank you guys again for having me.
Well, Brandon, thanks for doing all of that and sharing all that you've shared. For those of y'all that have not yet heard his podcast, you definitely need to take time to do that. The amount of research that went into delivering that podcast, and you heard him this evening talking and quoting sources, and it's phenomenal the amount of research that Brandon has done. So thank you so much for that. And if you haven't checked out his podcast, you need to do that because, as he said, this 30 minutes that he just shared is just the beginnings of hopefully whetting your appetite for a lot more information. So Brandon, let's we'll go to the questions that I had captured here during your presentation, and then we'll also address the questions that some of the others have, and then I want to go back to talk a little bit more detail on the Declaration, and then also I'll tease out. I wanted to hear some more about the Constitution, because I've seen the Constitution printed in a paper, but I've not seen the Declaration. So finding that on the San Antonio Report was tremendous, and thank you so much for translating that and making that available. I'd like to talk about the Constitution, but before we get there, the names of the junta members. So we see the Constitution, but what were some of the names of the junta members? Do you know who they are, and then where can we find those?
Yeah, so I don't have them at the tip of my head. Let me see if I can find the signatories to the Declaration here. Let me see if I can find this.
Because I think the junta members and the signatories aren't necessarily the same folks.
They're not. No, they're different, because the junta is very deliberately chosen as a local group. And like I said, it's 4 delegados and 3 arrochas. I don't know if I have those at my hand. The signatories of the Declaration are, here we go, I've got them here. I've got Jose Maria Guadiana, Jose Ignacio de Aval, Juan Melendez, Rafael Alvarado, Tomás Oquillas, Crescencio Vargas, José Feliz Pérez, José María Muñoz, José Manuel Prieto, José Nicolás Benítez, Jesús Cantú, Miguel Cortinas, Juan José Tijerina, José Antonio Guerra, Bernardo Benavides, Pedro Arispe, and Lucas Cantú. And so most of these people that are the signatories, these are mostly people that are coming up from the Rio Grande Valley, that have come up from the Rio Grande Valley with Gutierrez de Lara. Versus the members of the junta are people from San Antonio for the most part, as you can tell by their last names. But no, I'm sorry, I don't have their names handy with me. I'd have to dig and find those. So.
Yeah, no worries. So for those of us that are interested, so we know that we can find the Declaration both transcribed as well as translated, and then there's also a link to a copy, I guess, that you had found. Where did you find the Declaration?
So in the Archivo General de la Nación in Mexico City, it's a funny story. Speaking about bureaucracy and stuff, so I went myself first to try to go into the archivo to try and look through some of these files from Joaquín de Arredondo, who was the royalist general who defeated this revolt in Texas in 1813. And I showed up there, and they basically wouldn't let me in, because I wasn't a licensed investigator, and there's kind of a process that you have to go through to be able to be a licensed investigator, to be able to come in. And so anyway, so I found a licensed investigator, a friend basically, and I sent him in, And there's also a very tedious process for removing documents out. But he was kind enough to when he found this declaration, he took photos of it. He took photos of it non-flash, with his camera, and was able to bring those out. And so, with those photos, we were able to transcribe the document and then actually translate the whole thing. Because like you, I could never find the whole thing in any one place. I found bits and pieces of it here and there. And so anyway, we were real proud to find that and be able to publish that. And I'll say this too, the Constitution, which they approved on April 17th, 1813, that's one you can find. There's a website called the Sons of DeWitt Colony, which is a kind of cool resource. It has a lot of old documents that are public domain or that are kind of hard to find. It has Jose Antonio Navarro's memoirs. It has Jose Antonio Menchaca's memoirs. But anyway, it actually has the 1817 Constitution on that website. So Sons of DeWitt Colony. Here, I'll see if I can write this here.
That's okay. Don't worry about it. We'll I've got that link. Cool. I will share that with everybody who's dialed in this evening, and even those that couldn't attend, along with the recorded presentation. So folks will get that. And then I'll also share in the email to everybody the link that you have for those that want to help out and donate to your cause to find the Battle of Medina. So that's absolutely fascinating. So reading through the Declaration, I find where, like you said, much of the similar words that we would find in the U.S. Constitution as well as the Constitution of Cadiz. One of the things I found interesting, I kind of chuckled as you get towards the end. So, he talks about this new republic, this new government that's going to be kind of by the people and for the people, right? But, well, as long as I'm the president, right, I'm the governor, and these junta members, they will cast the votes on who will be the next governor. It's not like they're going to expand voting to all of the citizens of this new Republic of Texas. So I kind of chuckled at that. What did you think about that?
Yeah, that's a good point, and it's a criticism that it's one of the theories for why Gutierrez de Lara is later deposed, just about 3 months after this, by his own junta. So I generally have a pretty charitable view toward Gutierrez de Lara, or at least charitable is the wrong word, but I'm quite impressed by what he's done in pulling together, again, this multi-ethnic force that eventually numbers almost 1,400 or 1,500 men of all these different backgrounds. And I don't think there's many people that could do that. He clearly had a certain kind of charisma to be able to pull these together. But, as you can see in this document and in the Constitution, they don't create a particularly democratic government is what comes out of this. Now, I think you can be sympathetic and say, this is a wartime government too, though. This is a wartime document. It's rushed out pretty quickly. They're clearly under very, very trying circumstances. But this will be one of the theories or one of the critiques of Gutierrez de Lara over the coming months, is that he was too controlling or too dictatorial in kind of his drive to keep these things under his control. I think so. Gutierrez de Lara is a fascinating guy because he doesn't disappear from Mexican history after this event either. So he gets run off just a few weeks before the Battle of Medina, which means he survives. He survives this whole exercise. He ends up riding out the next 8 or 9 years in New Orleans. He'll actually fight with Andrew Jackson at the Battle of New Orleans. There was a very solid contingent of other Mexicans and Tejanos that are going to fight at the Battle of New Orleans or support in some way, shape, or form. But Gutierrez de Lara will actually come back to Mexico in 1824 as the first governor of Tamaulipas. And he'll also actually famously, he'll be the one who gives the order to execute Agustín Iturbide, who was the first ruler of Mexico after independence. And again, Gutierrez de Lara was just following the law. The National Congress had passed this law that said he had to do it. But he's a complicated figure. He's clearly dynamic. He's clearly charismatic. He's clearly kind of single-minded. Once you get an idea, he gets an idea in his head. Judging by later events, I don't think it's fair to call him dictatorial or egomaniacal in the same way as like a Santa Anna or something like that. But he's clearly, I think single-minded is probably the idea. And I think he believes very fervently in his own vision for how to get these things done. And yeah, sometimes often at the expense of democratic niceties. So yeah, you do have to wonder how sustainable, this government would have been had it not been, defeated 4 months later at the Battle of Medina with this kind of shaky precedent at the beginning of it. So it's a fair point.
So for our participants that have dialed in this evening, what questions do you have of Brandon?
And by the way, again, going back to that escaping to Louisiana thing, again, seeing the Curvelos and the Delgados and a bunch of those names. If you ever do your genealogy and you wonder why you had some ancestors living in Natchitoches, Louisiana for like 9 years between 1813 and 1821, it's because of the battle. It's because of the Battle of Medina. And by the way, this informs part of the reason too why the story of the Battle of Medina gets a little bit lost in the story of this republic, because it was not a fashionable thing to have been a part of. It was. I talk about this in my podcast too, the brutal aftermath of the Battle of Medina, where the Spanish commander comes into San Antonio. Over the course of 3 months, he'll execute something like 300 San Antonio men. He throws all the women into La Quinta, the biggest single building in town, hundreds of women and children, and forces them to grind corn for like 20 hours a day. And there's women that die in there. They suffer terrible assaults. It's a really, really traumatic thing for everyone who lives through it. And so I see one of the comments here, like, in terms of giving context to what San Antonians and what Tejanos have in mind for the next 20 years, they don't forget these events. They don't forget these events. And so when 1835-36 comes back around, there's a huge overlap between the people that were in the Royalist Army in 1813 and the people that are in Santa Anna's Centralist Army in 1835-36. Santa Anna himself was at the Battle of Medina as a young Royalist officer, but among others too, Domingo Ugartechea was also there, Vicente Filisola, like other of these officers under Santa Anna that are marching up in 1835-36 had been to San Antonio before, and the people in San Antonio remembered them. And of course, most San Antonians had been more sympathetic to the Republican cause and had suffered pretty greatly for it. So, yeah, it's a tragic story, and I think that's part of why it gets lost. And of course, it generally just gets kind of forgotten and overshadowed by the way the story was told for so long too. But at least in terms of explaining Tejanos' motivations for independence in Texas, because again, too, several historians have demonstrated this, that Tejanos will go on to participate in a higher percentage of their population in the events of 1835-36 than Anglos will. The reason for that is directly related to the events of 1813. I mean, I think that's the shorthand version of it. So.
Robert Tarin has a couple of questions. One, he says, how do you think the people felt about the consequences of the revolt, knowing that they were risking everything?
Yeah, I mean,
I like your comment in your podcast, and I think you even quoted it again recently when you were hosted by San Felipe the Austin, about one of the Arrocha ladies, if I'm not mistaken. What did she say? What were her thoughts about Arredondo?
Oh yeah, I mean,
and most of all the participants are adults here, so.
Yeah, I mean, so the women in San Antonio, it's incredible how they fight back after this too. So first off, when the victorious Royalist army is marching into San Antonio, the San Antonio women are taking pot shots at them with pistols and stuff, and so. This of course only though provokes kind of the ire, the vengefulness of the Spanish soldiers even more. But there's a couple points where a couple of these women will try and challenge the Spanish commander. There's one of them that yells at him that she's going to skin him and make a drum out of his belly. And so he slaps her over the top of his head with the broadside of his sword. And she says, what is he too afraid to give her a sword so that she can fight him back? And he kind of chuckles or whatever. And she says, here, I'll even do it with my hands behind my back to make it fair. Like just the level of I don't know, of gumption is pretty hard to imagine, because again, it's just like it's laughable compared to what we consider like political. It's so easy to make a Facebook comment today, you know what I mean? And I think people think of that as a form of civic engagement, which is compared to what these people risked and what they went through it's insulting. I mean, when they say that they're going to risk their fortunes and their lives and their honor, like they mean it. And most of the guys who signed that wouldn't be alive 4 months later to talk about it. So I mean, it just puts in perspective. And look, I'm not actually advocating that we go back to a time where we have to put our lives on the line for stuff like that. I mean, it's great that we're not going to have to live through. I mean, some estimates are that a third of the population of the European descended population of Texas would die in these years, from the battle and from the aftermath of the battle and from stuff like that. Like, that's just too traumatic to think about. So anyway, and I see Robert Tarin's other question, was the disconnect from deep Mexico really strongly felt, like they were forgotten citizens? It really is. And this is an important point too, that I'll talk about in the next season of the podcast, is that this identity of Mexico is really kind of a new idea that they're still working through in 1813 and even up into like 1840. That under the Spanish crown, the things that we think of as Spanish North America was actually like 12 different provinces. It's like 3 different kingdoms, 4 different command general, like captaincy generals, and the Texas was a part of the intendancy of the Northeast. So the provincias internas del noroeste. So it was like Texas and Nuevo León and Coahuila and Tamaulipas were kind of grouped together as an entity. And actually, after independence, they considered trying to form kind of their own super state. But again, it was kind of with this idea of still remaining confederated with other parts of Mexico. But there's strong cultural differences, as even today, between northern Mexico and southern Mexico. It's definitely a feeling from the people along the frontier in Texas, along the Rio Grande, that there's just a giant sucking sound going toward Mexico City. Just this feeling of resources always being pulled toward Mexico City without ever getting anything in return for it. That this is part of what gives them their identity so much too, is that they have to defend their own borders. They have to fight the Indios Barbaros, the hostile Comanches and Apaches and stuff, that they don't get any help from the taxes that they're remitting back to Mexico City for this. And so, yeah, it's a very palpable sense of grievance and a very palpable sense of a disconnect. And look, it goes both ways. Well, here's a good example. If you go to Mexico City today and you tell them that you're from Coahuila, or that you're from if you tell them you're from anywhere outside of Mexico City, they're going to say that, provinciano, eres de la provincia. You're from the provinces. Like, the idea is that there is the metropolitan capital city and everything else. And so, in some way, what you see in Mexico ultimately is the triumph of centralism. I talk about this in the podcast too, this battle between centralism versus federalism. And Tejanos, almost to a man, not entirely, but almost to a man and woman, we're very much in the federalist camp. And it makes sense. They're very far from the centers of power. So they don't benefit from power being concentrated in the center. They want power to be more devolved into their local communities and things like this. And in some ways, the story of Mexico is kind of the story of the slow accretion of power back into the center. And even in the 20th century, this is kind of the PRI. The PRI's great vision was, they were neither leftist nor rightist. They were about having everything ordenado, ordered from the center. And you can even argue too that AMLO, the current Mexican president too, kind of continues in that tradition a little bit too, that kind of centralist tradition, that more so than being an ideologue of the left or of the right, it's an ideology of kind of centralism. So anyway, that's a long answer to a short question, but that's my perception anyway of reading these accounts. So
excellent, fantastic. So what more can you share about? Well, before I ask that question, let me ask anybody else that's dialed in. Do you have a question? Let's see. Lisa Santos says, my ancestor Labon was jailed for being a foreigner and property taken, but have not read any indication that he participated. He's actually, he is on the list of the insurgents. Have you seen or read any documents otherwise? Yeah, he's on the list of the insurgents.
Is he really? Okay.
Yeah. So there's a list. So following the Battle of Medina in 1813, we're not going to say much here because we're going to have Brandon come back and we're going to dive deep if depending on what is actually going to be happening, whether or not we're actually being able to attend things in person. Regardless, we're going to have Brandon back and we're going to talk about the Battle of Medina. But Lisa, following the Battle of Medina, Joaquin Arredondo commissioned Luis Galan and Jose Antonio Salcedo to take an inventory of the insurgents' property, and they named 96 people on this list. And then they inventory their property, and then he also names a set of, I think it was 6 individuals that were to be experts to assess and give costs to a price to these to these seized properties. So cattle, houses. He had a blacksmith, a silversmith. He had a stonemason, and so they gave estimates on the value of the property that was seized. And in that list of 96, you'll find your ancestor. I think he's called the French Bomb, is how he's listed. But he's definitely on the list of 96. And he did have his. You're absolutely right. He did have his property taken.
Which is a strong suggestion that yes, he participated in some way, shape, or form.
In some role, right? He had some role. We don't know for sure whether he was on the battlefield. Was he a sympathizer? Was he, one of the gentlemen, Antonio Baca, gave 5,000 pesos to the cause, and so sure enough, his name shows up on the list too.
Yeah. And so, I've pulled together from all the sources I could find, I've recreated a list of about 315 members of the Republican Army of the North. And I've just recently found a new source from Gerald Pollo, the professor that Art Martinez de Vara has, that we're going to try and we've got some new names on that one too. So, the story is that the Republican Army numbered about maybe somewhere between 1,000 and 1,400 men or something like that. And, we've made it up to maybe 400 or so. We're trying to figure out who was there. But again, This was something that if you participated in, you didn't want to be remembered for that. It would be 8 years before most of these men and women were forgiven. Actually, I mean, there's a Santos in here too. I see a Santos on the call. There's a De Los Santos, a woman on here, a Josefa de Los Santos or something like that. It would be 8 years before most of these people were pardoned, and so this was a long-lasting, trauma and a long-lasting effect for these people's lives who participated in this. So a lot of them wanted it to be forgotten, wanted, or at least their participation to be forgotten.
Yeah. So just to that point. So my ancestor Clemente Delgado is on the list. He is deported. There's an 1814 deportation order. Him and two Arrochas are deported. So according to the order, they were supposed to go to Monclova, but the family I haven't been able to find him where he ended up. But the family is in Louisiana for the next from 1813 to 1829. He shows up in 1819. There's a letter from the governor. I want to say it was Martinez at the time. Announcing the fact that he was escorting, or he was having escorted Clemente Delgado back to San Antonio because he wanted to reestablish his household. And so we find in 1820 Clemente is petitioning the town council for a certificate of good citizenship. So you're absolutely right. There was a long period of time there, and then he finally in 1822 he along with Ana Maria de Rocha. Petitions the government for reinstating their property to get it back, and take another 6 more years. You talked about how slow the government was. It would take 6 more years before they actually would get their property back. And then, unfortunately, for Ana Maria's case, she was I think she died like the next year in 1829. She dies, and Clemente's in 1830.
Well, and that's part of like the frustrating tragedy, I think, for a lot of San Antonians of these events is that they were kind of at the forefront. I'm saying San Antonians, but it's Tejanos generally and residents of the Villas del Norte and the Rio Grande. All these kind of frontiers people that participated in this. They were very much keeping this flame of revolt alive for these years, and yet when Mexican independence happens in 1821. It's deeply unsatisfying because basically what happens is that you have the royalists, the Mexican royalists basically switch sides. The Mexican royalists basically decide, okay, we can get on board with this independence thing as long as we're kind of still in charge of stuff. And so Mexico achieves its independence, but it achieves it under the people that had been kind of most actively fighting against it. And so there's never really a reckoning for these people like these San Antonians and like these descendants that we're talking about who had been at the forefront, who had suffered for this, who lost their property, who lost their loved ones, who lost their lives. Most of them will never really get that back. And there's a deep-seated, sense of injustice for that because, and again, too, this goes back to like in the 1830s when you have the reascendance of a lot of these royalists now as centralists in Mexico City, it's almost like they achieved independence only to be kind of still ruled by the same people.
Exactly.
And so it's deeply, deeply dissatisfying. And again, I think this is what's very motivating for Tejanos, for Coahuilenses, people in Coahuila too, are very kind of animated by this also, and that they're gonna rise up in 1834 and 35, against Santana.
Anybody else?
I see Lisa has a question there. Is there a list of those executed in town? I don't have that. I think the number was 327 people is what jumps to my mind. And that's from Arredondo's own record, from his own hand. He recorded that he executed over 3 months 327 people. But no, I've never seen a list of who all that included.
Any other questions? So, Brandon, can you tell us more about this excursion, this seeking of the actual battlegrounds that you've got going on? So you showed a slide where you've partnered with a really neat organization that does a lot of good with the veterans. So when do you think that might happen? How can, if those of us that want to help, beyond making a donation, how can we help? What can we do?
So the plan is to be able to conduct these field surveys in this coming winter, in January, February. There's a couple of reasons for that, not least of which because you don't want to do field surveys in the summer in Texas because it's miserable, but also because the vegetation is down. The grass dies down, so it's easier to do pedestrian surveys and to kind of really walk across fields in an organized fashion and transects. So it's important for us to do this with trained archaeologists. And so this is why we partnered with the American Veterans Archaeological Recovery Group. Why also we're working with the Texas Historical Commission is people have been looking for this battlefield for a long time. And there's a lot of theories of the location of the battlefield. Actually, there's at least 3 different markers that mark the location of the battlefield today. And so, but none of them really are based on archaeological evidence of it. And one of the really frustrating things about this battle when you study it is that, there's only about 10 different accounts of the battle. So it's not hard to read all the different primary accounts, but they all have like some contradictory detail to them. So just when you think you've got it all figured out, one of the accounts will say something that doesn't quite cuadrar, that doesn't quite line up with the other details in another account, and so you have to kind of go back and figure out, what you're going to believe from which accounts. So we've narrowed down on a couple areas of high interest. We found a couple artifacts in certain areas that are suggestive to us that they might be interesting areas. But to really kind of conclusively find this, we're going to have to find a concentration of artifacts, because this was a 2 to 4 hour long battle. There were at least 950 cannonballs fired by just one side, not to mention innumerable musket rounds and rifle shots. So there should be a concentration of artifacts somewhere. But the challenge too is that the soil is super, super sandy here. It's like beach sand. A lot of it has been mined for sand over the years, for aggregate, for frac sand, for things like that. And so it's very hard to get access to some of these areas too. But our plan is basically, we're putting together all of our archaeological methodologies right now. We're applying for some grants. We're raising some money. On August 18th, we're going to take advantage of Atascosa County always has their Battle of Medina Symposium. So we're going to use that symposium to kind of bring together anyone who's interested. And I invite all of you guys to come and almost have like a roundtable, just brainstorming session, where everyone can kind of throw out their theories of the battle and their theories for the clues that we could follow or should follow to look for this. Then the goal, like I said, we've already started securing landowner access to several of these properties, and we're going to continue to do that until the winter. And then the goal is in January or February to go out there actually with field crews to do these very systematic transects, basically, to set up a grid in these areas of high interest, and to really systematically go through with trained archaeologists and do these things and do the work the right way. So with metal detectors and small shovels and everything like that. So like I said, the best way you can support is to continue to tell people that we're trying to do this. To bring attention for us. I think there will be opportunities eventually for volunteers to help out, even on the ground. Although, again, like I said, we want to make sure that we're using, trained archaeologists to access people's property, just to make sure that we're documenting everything the right way and giving everyone the comfort that if we do find something, we can definitively say that it's been cataloged in the right way. But please do keep following us. Like I said, subscribe to the podcast. You'll hear more about it. And please share what we're doing, on your social media and with your networks.
Excellent. Fantastic. So one more time, folks, any questions of Brandon before we close out this evening's discussion?
Thanks, everybody. I really appreciate the time. I love talking about this. And anyway, and thank you, Anthony, and your group for, I think you guys do important work with keeping a lot of these issues alive. And I love your presence on social media and really grateful for it. So.
Well, Brandon, thank you so much for making your time available this evening to share all that you know about this. Your passion is just remarkable. It's just absolutely remarkable. And I don't know that anybody has done as much as you've done. Absent maybe Judge Thonoff. But I think you're running up close to catching him in the race.
He had a 60. He's got 60 years of head start ahead of me. So maybe by the time I'm his age, I will have done as much as he did.
I tell you what, you're definitely if it was a marathon, you're definitely catching up. God bless him, and he did send an email out, and he's showing his colors. The colors are on his garage door. He's got the Burgundian flag, and he's got the green flag for the Republican Army of the North. So he's got those colors flying. He'll continue to do that through August the 18th. So Brandon, thanks again for coming this evening, and we'll definitely get back with you in August. Let me see here. It looks like I've got a note. It's just a comment. So thank you very much, and a great presentation from Robert and Rosie. So thanks again. Thanks everybody for dialing in, and we'll be chatting again. Take care. I hope you'll join me in supporting Brandon and his efforts in finding Medina. Here you'll find the website address https://tinyurl.com/supporting finding Medina. At that website, you'll be able to contribute to the cause and help us find Medina.